Okay, so this is the interactive web authoring module lecture on HTML and CSS frameworks. So this is our agenda that we're going to go through today. Throughout the lecture, these are the topics that we're going to review and discuss and explore. So first of all, what is a CSS framework? First of all, a framework, generally speaking, is a set of practices and concepts that help us deal with a problem. And it could be taking us through a process, whether that's building a house, applying for a mortgage, or whatever it is. The framework guides us through the process and helps us streamline our thoughts and deal with the important issues at hand. And when we apply this framework, this definition of a framework to web design, to HTML and CSS, it becomes a package that is made up of a structure of files, folders, and code that streamlines our build process. So a lot of decisions are already made for us, a lot of issues are resolved, and we can use this as a very good foundation to build a website or a project upon. Most websites will share a similar structure. Okay, when you look at a web server and the files that are stored for a website, you'll have the image file, you have a JavaScript file, CSS file, you'll have different files and structures that will generally be quite similar no matter what website you're looking at. Obviously, more complex sites will have more complex structures compared to simple, maybe 4, 5, 6 page websites, but the general image will be the same, what we're looking at. And the idea of a framework is to provide this common structure right out of the box so that we don't have to think about it. It's already there and we can just start working. That's kind of the idea of a framework in a nutshell. It really allows us to cut out much of the hard work at the beginning and saves us a lot of time and allows us to move forward. So from the award site that we've used at different times during this module, the aim of a framework is to provide a common structure so that developers don't have to redo it from scratch and can reuse the code provided. It really cuts down our time of thinking about what we're going to name different classes and different parts of our code, because it's already done for us, so we can really just push on with what we actually need to do. Next, we have the different categories of frameworks, and there are three layers. We're only really going to focus on the presentation layer or the front end interface, where what the user sees in this module. You'll be looking at the other two layers, the back end layer and the data layer, maybe in your web apps module, but in this module we're purely thinking about what the user sees and what we build in the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. And so how many types are there? We've kind of answered this question. There are two, the front end and the back end, because the data layer and the back end layer go hand in hand. You can't really have the back end layer without the data layer, because one deals with the other and helps you access the data layer where all the information is stored. But like I said, we're only focusing on the front end at the minute. So what do we usually find in a front end framework? Well, we'll always find the code. Okay, we'll have the CSS source code with the HTML code, and this will always work within a grid system. This allows the developer to position different elements, make up the site design in a simple and versatile fashion. We'll have typography. There will be, like I said, a lot of the decisions are made for us in a framework. So the typography will be loaded in there already. Maybe Google Fonts, maybe Fontface, but whichever it is, it will be there, and then it's just up to us to make the decisions as to what typography we want to use. There'll be solutions for browser incompatibility, so that the site will display correctly on all browsers, and this really helps with so many problems, because you don't have to worry about it. We don't have to worry about whether our client or whoever's looking at the website is using Internet Explorer, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Opera. It's all taken care of. We don't even need to worry about all the different versions within that when we think about different companies with different security levels and different rollout times for different versions of browsers. that's all taken care of. It's always going to work the way we design it. That is a huge problem solver right there. There'll also be then the creation of standard CSS classes, which can be used to style the advanced components of the user interface. And again, this saves time because when the classes are already named, all we need to do is find out what their name is and call them into our code, and then job. The image below is taken from the Foundation framework, and it will show you just through the different screens how the Foundation framework responds to every screen that we could use and view a website on. And this shows how the CSS grid has been adapted to create a responsive framework. So we don't need to worry about even our site being having responsive web design, because that's built in from the beginning also. And so frameworks really are a very quick solution to get us moving very quickly in any project. So what is the grid system? We've mentioned it, but what actually is it? Here's a very simple example of it. The columns are all called different classes, as you can see. There's G-D-6, G-D-12, C1, C2, and you can see we can vary these, we can move them around, but the classes are all the same name, or have all the same name. So every time we call that class in, that's the one that we're working with. So if we look with the two bottom rows, with the two columns asymmetrical layout, we can switch that around. We're still using the same classes, but it doesn't matter what order we use it in. So we can play around with our layout. We can have an image in C1, a bit of text in C2, and alternating that creates a different layout so that the user is reading different elements of the page, and they're moving and they're interacting with the page in a much more meaningful way than just reading text on a page like on a screen like it was on a page. So this grid system allows us to move and work with layout in a much more flexible way and create much more interesting web pages. So just following the text here, then it really follows historically from days of printing, when we didn't have computers. When we were working with printing presses, we had to build layouts, and it was a wee bit more complex and a bit more involved. But we can work with code that reproduces the same idea, but in a fraction of the time. And it helps provide a guide for designers to create multiple layouts that we can then save as templates and then just put them in whenever we want them. But it also supports responsive themes for different screen sizes. So we can always work with a layout that is meaningful, regardless whether we're looking at it on a data projector, on a widescreen TV, on a laptop, on our phone, on our tablet. It will always look the way the person who designed it intended it to look. So we'll divide the web page layout into columns, and we'll separate this with margins, and we'll use white space and between them. And the width of the columns and the margins will always be equal, because once we decide what they are, they're always going to be the same type. They're going to have the same values. And so the layout can always be consistent. We don't have to copy and paste code and risk making errors. Once it's done, it's done. And we call in the class as we need it. And we can work with placing content in one or more columns based on the layout of the design, working with the same code again and again, and always having the same perfect results. So using this grid means that our design can be divided into multiple columns, and this will help designers organize content. Most grid systems will work up to columns of rows of 12. So we could have 50%, halves. We can work in thirds, quarters, fifths, eighths, twelfths. It really depends on what the information we want to put out is, and we can design it accordingly. Most of our screens today will work with a 960 pixel width, and this is the general number that we would work with for laptops and a desktop model of a web screen. So when we're working towards this number, we can divide our numbers out, whether we're working with a 2-column, 3-column, 4-column, whichever it is. It will still look in the page the way we want it to do. But when we cut down to mobile screen, a tablet screen, again, it will still look the way we want it to. So as the interaction design foundation have said, quite simply, the application of a grid means that the design can be divided into multiple columns, and this can help designers organize content systematically, scientifically, and always have a good design that is consistent throughout the website. Now we're going to look at some of the most popular frameworks that are out there. The first one is Bootstrap, and this probably is the most popular one, probably without exception. It's in the 4th version of its framework, so it's been about for quite a while. It's got a lot of the market share, and probably quite justifiably, because it is very comprehensive. There are new aspects that have been introduced to version 4, as you can see, with new color schemes, new modifiers, utility classes, and so on. But some of the great things are that it has a powerful responsive design inbuilt to it. It has a lot of built-in libraries of resources, so we don't have to go searching for bits of code. It's already there, and we just call it in, and it speeds us up. We can have quick build prototypes. There are lots of templates that we can get off their site and off different areas, and build these sites pretty quickly. There are sites like Bootsnip, which give us snippets of code which work in Bootstrap, and we can just put that in, and it links instantaneously to the pre-existing libraries that are there, and allows us to build very flexible but very good and very strong frameworks. And then there's the low learning curve. Because a lot of work has been done, we can get solutions pretty quickly. So it is a very good framework to use, and it's probably the best framework to start with because there's so much there. Next up, we have Foundation. I've used this a lot with a lot of my other classes, and it is very flexible in the front end. It's built with responsive HTML in from the beginning. There are good templates available to help really build up those quick sites, and there's a lot of good user interface components. Framework is different from some of the others because it also gives us an email capability. Within your career as a web designer, you may probably end up coding an email campaign at some point, and this is a pretty good framework to use because a lot of the work's done for you, so you can really iterate the campaign pretty quickly and get it because a lot of the hard work's done through this framework. This framework also enjoys some good online webinar support, and this would be a key feature that I would advise people to look for when they're starting out with frameworks. You will have questions, and you need to have the opportunity and the ability to find those answers. And with Bootstrap and with Foundation, those opportunities are there to find those answers. Foundation is also easy to customize, which is obviously part of the reason we use it. But the easier it is to customize, the better you'll feel about it, and the more confident you'll feel in using it. Next up, we have Semantic UI, which takes a different tack from a lot of the other frameworks. Frameworks generally, and Bootstrap in particular, is marketed as being written by nerds for nerds, which basically means you're working with nerd language in terms of the HTML code. It's not user friendly, and there's no way you're going to look at the code and be able to decipher or guess what class that refers to, because like we saw in the column layout screen, it could be D-5-L. You can never guess what that class refers to. But Semantic UI takes the line of, let's try and make these user friendly, and that just makes your life a little bit easier because you know what you're looking for. Your memory will kick in a lot easier when you're thinking about a class that has a user-friendly name compared to something that is just characters and digits. The layouts in this framework are good. It's got good, concise HTML. It's got intuitive JavaScript, and it really is hitting now more towards a more streamlined version of a framework in terms of its HTML code. That it's not heavy. There's if we explain this, a heavy framework would be one like Bootstrap, where there is the potential for lots of code and downloading lots of options. And if you don't know what you're choosing, you could download download it all and make use of it all when you don't need it. But a lightweight framework is one that is obviously smaller in size. There's less code, but there's less chance for code that you're not using. But this allows you to make websites with the code that you need. You don't need to worry about everything else. It's just giving you the bare bones. And so these frameworks now are beginning to get more towards that, and Semantic UI is pretty good that way. Continuing that frame then, that vein, is UIKit. It's lightweight. It's good CSS framework. It's working again in a similar line as Semantic UI. It's working with the user interface elements, and it's a minimalist approach. It's looking just to give you what you need, not lots of bloat in your code. It's just quite, it's just getting on and getting on with it. There are useful UI components. It's compatible with less and Sass, which can be useful. It does include JavaScript, which is pretty important. It is becoming slightly less important because there is a lot of things that we can replace JavaScript with CSS. Image sliders, for example. Why use JavaScript when you can do it in the CSS, and it'll speed up your website because you're loading less files. And as is pretty much a standard, it works in any modern web browser. We need to have that element, otherwise a framework is severely restricted if it can't work with the modern browsers. I think this is our last one, but Skeleton is exactly as it sounds. It's the bare bones of a framework. It's 400 lines of code, which is next to nothing. Okay, the BBC homepage is a couple of thousand lines of code, but this is giving you the basis of a framework in 400 lines from which you can build your website. So it really is just giving you the bare essentials of what you need. You won't use this for every framework because this is maybe designed more towards smaller projects. So if you were building a single page website, maybe a coming soon page, a holding page, then this may work well for that type of mini project while you're working on the bigger project. Bootstrap can do that too, but this is really just giving you the minimal amount of what you need. It's built with mobile in mind. It is easy to learn. It's 400 lines of code, so you'll get through it very, very quickly. And it is really built with the idea that this is going to be the skeleton, but you're building everything else on top of it, and you're getting on from there. But it's still a very good choice to make. And there are, as you can see, loads more. We can't go through them all because there are so many different types. They all have their own strengths and weaknesses. A lot of designers will use a smaller framework simply as a basis to build their site off. They maybe won't use Bootstrap or Foundation, but you may find they use the responsive grid system in every site they do because it just works for what they need it to do. A bit like the Mayor reset CSS file that we used in class a number of weeks ago. It just works. It does what it needs to do, and we can just get on with things and start from there. So sometimes these CSS frameworks can be pretty good and very useful, just for giving you that extra bit of organization in your layout. So how do we choose the right framework? Because it's one thing knowing about them, it's another one entirely knowing which one to choose. And quite simply, choosing the right framework is far from simple. Okay, every site is different. Every project will require different needs. Every client will be different. And everything you do will always differ from what you did before. There is also the learning curve where you'll always want to improve on what you did before. And so it's maybe not always right to choose a framework, but you may not always choose the same framework. The good news is that in point 2, there aren't many significant differences in a lot of the frameworks. So in one respect, it doesn't totally matter which one you choose. It does come down to personal choice, and some do work better for people than others. I know in my level 3 class, for the last 2 years, Foundation framework has worked really well with them for some reason, but they just can't get into Bootstrap. And I've put both to them, and they've come back to Foundation every time. And I can't totally explain it. It just works better for them. So in terms of the framework of what they're using, that works. So sometimes you have to just go with that. But you have to go through the process. It can't just be an automatic choice. Otherwise, you may not be making the right choice for various reasons. So points to remember, which we kind of left off in that last slide, that you need to remember when you're choosing a framework. You can't just go through it on autopilot. The speed of installation, some will be quick, some will not be quick at all, and some will be quite confusing. Parts of Bootstrap can be quite confusing if you're not familiar with it, whereas working with Skeleton with 400 lines of code, it's going to be, you know, pretty much your download time. Ease of understanding is obviously a huge aspect, and it's not necessarily just your own understanding. It could be the team that you're working with. It's one thing for you to do things yourself, but when you're working with a team, you need to be mindful of their strengths and their weaknesses. And if you're pulling in a new framework that they've never worked before, that there may be a bit of time that you need to cater for, that they have time to get familiar with that framework and get up to speed with it. Options as well. Some of these will be complex, some will give you great configurations, some will give you great widgets, some will give you interface options, some won't. But this point may or may not be an issue. And if it is an issue, you may want this level of complexity, you may not want it. So it really depends what you want and what you need as to whether this is something that you'll consider, but you need to remember it. Integration with other systems. A lot of those bigger frameworks now will offer maybe integration with Git, or so you can store on GitHub, or lots of other systems, maybe with Ruby and other programming languages. And this may again be an issue that you need, or a requirement that you must have. And so these points alone may exclude certain frameworks from your list based on the answers. And lastly, we have already discussed this, whether you're learning these frameworks or whether you're using them professionally, you want to go with something that has best long-term support. Chances are with something like Skeleton, where it's only 400 lines of code, you may not need a lot of support because it's 400 lines of code that you can work with quite well yourself. But if you're working with Bootstrap, you will want something there that if something comes up, if there's a question or a problem or an issue that you haven't accounted for or planned for or even dreamt of, you want to be able to go and find an answer. Equally with Alexa Foundation, having a webinar where you could even sit with the person on the other end of the screen and ask them questions and say, look, here's a bit of code that we're working on, here's a problem, how do we solve this? So having that sounding board can be really important, and so it's a good point to remember when choosing a framework. Advantages then of using frameworks, and we've kind of touched on this a bit already, but some of these are quite straightforward and pretty much common sense. But the speed of the project delivery, of course, it's a huge thing. If you have a quick, tight turnaround, a framework can be a perfect answer. I had a boss once actually who needed came to me basically at 9:30 one day and said he needed a site up, holding site up on this domain, and he needed a site designed really quickly. He wanted it basically within an hour, and while I maybe negotiated, I think maybe 90 or an hour and a half to 2 hours, I used the Bootstrap framework, got a site up really quickly. All the design decisions were made for me, but in terms of the speed of my project delivery, I was able to meet the project on time. And in this instance, he was happy with what I put up because it was better than what he was thinking of. He was just looking for a quick holding page, but using Bootstrap allowed me to put up a level of design that wasn't always maybe necessary for a holding page, but it just looked a wee bit different, and it worked really well for what we were doing, and it really ticked the box. So if there is something that's almost an emergency level of speed, a framework can be a perfect answer because you don't have the time to choose out all the perfect font or spacing or the margins and white space and so on. You just sometimes need those decisions made for you, and so this is a huge advantage of using a framework. You then have clean and tidy code, which again is a huge thing because while I may be working on the code today, someone else in my team may be working on it tomorrow or next week, and even if I'm working on it today and come back in 6 weeks, it needs to be clean and tidy for me to be able to make sense of it, because it won't always be in your head what you were doing, what your thought process was. So keeping clean and tidy as a general practice is always a good point to remember. And this never more so within a framework, because you didn't write the framework. So you need to have it clean and tidy so that you can make best sense of it as quickly as possible. Browser compatibility we discussed earlier. Of course, this is a great advantage. I've had clients in the past as well losing their temper with me because the site that they were looking at wasn't working, and I couldn't see the problem because unknown to me, the browser I was looking at was not the browser they were looking at. They were working with Internet Explorer, and as soon as I opened Internet Explorer, I could see the issue. But had I been using a framework, that would not have been an issue. And so sometimes using a framework, again, can solve problems and avoid problems that you don't always think about in the first instance. You'll then learn good practices. I did mention earlier that frameworks are built by nerds for nerds. And whether you like it or not, you're on a computing degree course, so you are technically a nerd like the rest of us. But you need to learn good practices, and that doesn't matter whether you're writing HTML, Java, Python, or an essay. You need to have these good practices. And so using a framework, someone else has written it, someone else has built it, and they've baked in these good practices from the very beginning. And so by you continuing to use them, you continue on those good practices, and you pretty much bring them in by osmosis, that because you're using them, you're familiar with them, you then continue them, and that's a huge thing. Frameworks can then also be, I think we've said this as well, helpful for collaborative work. You will more than likely be working in a team at some point in your career. There will be other developers, senior developers, developers from other countries, other time zones. And so using a framework, everyone's working off the same code. You're going to have, and this ties into the next point, you're going to have a single procedure to resolve problems. There's going to be a single way to call in a class. Nobody's going to change it, because you would have to change everything, and that would muck it up for everyone. So no one's going to do that. So it helps good collaborative work, and it helps having a single procedure to resolve problems, because when you're working in a team, however many people are in the team, that's how many ways you can have to solve a problem. But if there's one standard procedure already there, chances are people will follow that. So it's a good advantage of having a framework. You then have ready-made documentation, and this is the stuff lecturers we will bang on about, but there's a reason for it, because you won't always be the only person writing the code. Documentation is there to help other people clue into your thought process, and it gives you your chance to explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it. And when someone else does that for you, that helps you build a better project, because you can use their documentation to your advantage. And the more that the documentation is there, the better it is for you. Lastly, we have discussed this already. Having online communities and access to help is a huge advantage. You won't know everything. You can't know everything. I don't know everything and can't know everything. So I'm going to ask questions, and I'm going to go online to find those answers. And so if there's online communities already pre-existing, chances are someone else somewhere in the world has had the same problem I've had. I've asked the question and got the answer. So I don't even have to ask the question. I just need to find it and get the answer, which speeds up my job no end, but it gets the job done. So these are huge advantages of using frameworks. But we equally have our disadvantages, and these are pretty much equal to our advantages, because we mix content and presentation. Some companies do have quite distinctly drawn lines between who's a developer and who's a designer, and while I might believe that those lines can be blurred, that's not true necessarily in a company. But where we're mixing content and presentation, if you don't know the difference between the two, then it's hard to learn if you're always working in a framework. We will always probably have, can't say always probably, we'll more than likely have unused code left over, but that's being loaded into your web page regardless, and that's going to slow your website. So having unused code, having too much code, having code that you're not using, however you want to dress it up, if it's not useful, it's still being loaded into your website. It's still taking time for the user to see your site, and it's still slowing you down. There can be a slower learning curve. Pretty much all of us by now should be able to build a website, but if I take you now and throw you into using a framework, you're tapping into someone else's way of working and someone else's way of naming classes and developing things, and there is a slower learning curve for that because you're not thinking naturally in the way you think. You're having to think artificially and think how would they think, and that's a hard thing to do, and so it does slow you down, and that is a disadvantage, especially if time is of the essence. This is a crucial one in the learning phase of life, but when you use a framework, you don't learn how to do it yourself. All the decisions might have been made for you, which may be a good thing, but you don't learn how to make those decisions yourself, and you don't learn why those decisions are important. You know, I mentioned earlier the reset CSS file by Mayer. If I don't explain to you why that's important, or if you don't find out, you don't know why you use it. So why continue using it if you don't know what advantage it gives you? But if you do know what it does, then it's of value, and you need to learn how to do this yourself. And that goes across the board in life, no matter what we're talking about. If you don't learn how to do something yourself, you're then also limited when it comes to later projects. You're always working within a framework. You don't step out beyond that because you see the safety in all the decisions being made for you, and you can't really go wrong, but you don't really go right either. And you don't learn, and you don't grow, and you don't expand, and you don't get better. Sites all look the same. If you want to see this yourself, take a quick search of Bootstrap websites or sites built with Bootstrap. Take a look at Pinterest, or take a look at Apple. Apple wasn't built using Bootstrap, but the similarities are the same. So we all know what Apple clone sites look like, but they all look like clones. And so when sites all look the same, it's hard to stand out. And if you don't stand out, you're not going to make best use of your website. So that can be an issue, especially for a client. They're not paying you to look the same as everyone else. They want to look different. So that is an issue and can be a big issue for clients. You can also inherit lots of other CSS problems. Like we've said, someone else has written this framework for you. They may have done the work, but you also inherit their problems. You inherit their mistakes, you inherit their lack of knowledge, you inherit their strengths, but you inherit their weaknesses. And that can create issues because they may have problems that you have no clue about. They may have left problems that you're not aware of, and because of this, we don't know how it's going to play out. So that can be a big disadvantage. Then there's the practical issue of overriding the framework code, and this is where you're maybe making changes to certain parts of the code in the CSS. You have to make sure you're making changes to all parts of the code. So it's one thing making change to the code for the desktop, but if you don't carry that through, whether it's changing color or font or size, font size, if you don't change that across all aspects of the CSS, you're going to get to that point and it's reverting back to the original, even though you've made the change. So you can end up with really messy code. And so that is a huge disadvantage in the practical sense, because you can then end up with just a lot of mistakes very quickly. Then lastly, you're learning a framework rather than learning CSS. And again, this ties in with not learning to do it yourself. It's one thing to be able to work within a framework, but it's a completely different thing being able to work within the CSS. A real world example of this is I learned French at school at a GCSE, and I got an A in it. But that allows me to get by when I'm in France. I can go into a shop and ask for a coffee and a croissant, but I can't sit and have a discussion with a Frenchman about politics. So while I've maybe learned a framework for getting by in French, I don't know the French language, and it's exactly the same here. You may learn the framework and may be really good at it, but you're not learning actual CSS. You're learning how to work within the framework. And we want you to be able to learn the CSS and be able to work in it. And that's the key, being able to work the actual language and then applying it to the framework, not the other way around. Is it advisable to use a framework? We've kind of answered this, but it's the real answer is not necessarily. It really depends on the project, and the key second point there is it's the developer's final decision. It may work and it may be advisable, it may be a good choice, but maybe not always. Frameworks are a good resource. They can be extremely useful for many people, but it doesn't always mean that they're going to be useful for you. and this can be true in coursework 2, it can be true in your web apps module. It really depends what you're doing. That's kind of the bottom line. But the key thing is now you know what they are, you know which ones are out there, and the advantages and disadvantages of using them. You can now go and play around with them and make that informed decision as to how useful they may be. The next part we have today are today's practicals, which hopefully you'll find challenging and interesting. You will find them challenging and interesting because I've chosen them that way. This is LinkedIn Learning. It's a great site for video content and for learning how to do things. And in this course, Bootstrap 4 Essential Training with Ray Villalobos, who we've seen before in other weeks, he's taking you through the essential parts of Bootstrap 4, and you'll be building a site with him. The second tutorial for today is working more so with the CSS frameworks and grids, but you're also working within those frameworks and how to start up a sample project and work with those. And it's that hands-on skills of working with these frameworks that you really get to understand their key strengths and weaknesses. Then we have our third tutorial is Bootstrap 4 tutorial from MD Bootstrap. This isn't a video content tutorial, it's word-based. So you're following the steps on this page and building a responsive website through Bootstrap. And then the final tutorial today is learning Bootstrap 4 in 30 minutes by building a landing page. So it's a single page site. By this point, you should be fairly familiar with the whole process. So by this point, I would hope that you're finding it a bit easier compared to maybe the very beginning. This site, Free Code Camp, is a great site. It is as it sounds, it's free code. There are great tutorials in this and very comprehensive. A lot of time has been spent on the site, and it's one that I would say absolutely use on a wider level to help your web design skills. And guys, that's the tutorial. Thank you very much.